Hello. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our discussion of the book Innocent Until Proven Muslim with author Maha Hilal. My name is Khury Petersen-Smith. I'm the Michael Ratner Middle East Fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, and I am thrilled to be hosting this conversation today. Maha, I'm going to introduce you momentarily, but just wanted to say hi. How you doing?
Good, thanks, Khury. It's nice to be here with you.
Awesome. I'm really excited about this. Let me say I'm coming to you all from Boston, located in Massachusetts and Wampanoag lands, and IPS offices are located in this place called Washington, D.C. in Piscataway lands. And today we will be discussing U.S. invasions of various nations. And I think it's always important to remind ourselves that the very first nations that the U.S. invaded are the nations and lands of the peoples located in this place, currently called the United States. So as we discuss surveillance and bordering policies directed at Muslims and migrants in this place today, we should understand these as ongoing practices of colonizing the land. And I know we're all committed to solidarity with indigenous struggles for self-determination. That's to kind of locate ourselves in place, and then to locate ourselves in time. This year, 2021, is, of course, the 20th anniversary of the September 11th attacks. And Maha and I were talking last night about, I mentioned being hopeful going into this year that the anniversary would be occasion for us in this country to have some critical revisiting of the past 2 decades of the war on terror. Unfortunately, the mainstream media and mainstream US politics, it was largely not the case, actually the opposite. And I think particularly around the withdrawal of US forces from Afghanistan, which, again, I was hoping for a little more around that event in particular in terms of a critical interrogation of the past 2 decades of US occupation, maybe naively hoping. Instead, it was an occasion, I would argue, for the president and other various US officials to reiterate some of the same tropes actually from 20 years ago about how Afghan women needed saving from the Taliban and how that saving comes in the form of US forces. That what has characterized the past 20 years of US military action in Afghanistan and implicitly elsewhere in the war on terror is not, those years are not characterized by American violence in the form of drone strikes, bombed weddings, bombed hospitals, torture, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but actually American benevolence. The narrative was that the US has sacrificed so much in terms of American life and American money. And that actually the problem, the collapse of the US-backed Afghan government is because Afghans wouldn't fight for themselves, that Americans were willing to fight, but Afghans wouldn't fight for themselves. And so we throw up our hands and have to leave. So that unfortunately has been the kind of predominant conversation, disrupted by, people doing amazing work, amazing Afghan amazing organization, Afghan American organizations, and people like Maha Hilal. With that, I just want to introduce her. Dr. Maha Hilal is a researcher, writer, and organizer working to dismantle and abolish the war on terror. Maha earned a PhD from the Department of Justice, Law, and Society at American University in Washington. She was the inaugural Michael Ratner Middle East Fellow at IPS, so I am following in her footsteps. She is a longtime campaigner to close the US prison camp at its naval base at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. She is the co-founder and co-director of the Justice for Muslims Collective, an incredible organization that does kind of an amazing range of activities, including challenging Islamophobic policing programs in the region where they are piloted, which is the DC, Maryland, Virginia area. And things like being in solidarity with Muslim workers. So an incredible range of activities that JMC does. And she is, of course, the author of the forthcoming book, Innocent Until Proven Muslim, Islamophobia, the War on Terror, and the Muslim Experience Since 9/11. Maha, author, organizer, my friend. I'm so grateful to share this
Um,
lunchtime discussion with you.
Thank you so much, Khury. It's really an honor to be here with you. And, we've had a lot of talks about US empire, US state violence, and, unfortunately, there's seemingly no end in sight. But I'm so grateful to be working with colleagues like you and friends. And you know, I don't usually have a lot of hope, let's be honest, but working with you gives me a little. So I'm excited about that.
Beautiful. Well, this book is such a timely and comprehensive contribution, to this project. And I want to start by just asking you, what led you to write it? How did you decide to write this book?
So let me go back to my PhD days, which, as most people know, are pretty miserable. But in my PhD, I wrote about Muslim American responses to the war on terror. And, my desire to write about this topic really stemmed from what I conceived of as a sort of a lack of understanding the real measurable ways that Islamophobia was entering into policy and discourse and how that was impacting Muslims. So, for example, in my earlier days when I started campaigning on Guantanamo Bay, there was hardly ever, or usually never actually, mention of the fact that those detained at Guantanamo were all Muslim. That fact continues to be ignored. And at the time it was extremely rare for anyone to mention it. And even at this juncture in time, when it is acknowledged, it is to say that people just say Muslim men at Guantanamo, and that's where it ends. There's no sort of analysis around what does that mean. We're acknowledging their religion for a purpose, but what does that actually mean in the analysis and what we need to disrupt in terms of closing facilities like Guantanamo Bay? Generally speaking, one of the reasons I wanted to write this book after my dissertation was, the way we've talked about the war on terror in the last 20 years, it's as if we don't know who the primary targets of this war have been. And for those of us perhaps in this organizing space and in this event right now, we know that the war on terror was designed to almost exclusively target Muslims. Yet that has continued to be left out again of the calculus, of the narrative, of the way we understand what it would take to dismantle the war on terror. So to me, this book was really about how do we understand the war on terror specifically through the lens of Islamophobia? And what do we do to mainstream this analysis? So it's not just, okay, we got to the point where we can acknowledge there are Muslims in Guantanamo, but again, what does that mean? How do we carry that forward in terms of understanding how we're going to intervene in such problematic and destructive policies?
That's super interesting, because, for those of us who do engage on questions of US militarism, we know that, as horrendous as these past 2 decades of the war on terror have been, this is not like the first set of wars that the US has launched, right? Like there's a long-standing set of violences from, the US state. And so, I'm just listening to you and thinking, there are folks who might know, or like it's sort of it's out there that like, yeah, there's some Islamophobia that's part of this, or like Muslims seem to be targeted, but there can be a kind of like colorblind or race blind, approach that doesn't really reckon with that. I'm just thinking about what you said about Guantanamo, and it's one thing to kind of use Muslim as a sort of identifier to identify the people, imprisoned there, but you can do that without interrogating Islamophobia as actually structuring the imprisonment itself.
Precisely. Yeah, and that's exactly right. And, I think that point continues to be missed, right? And when we think about even the sort of abuses and torture that have occurred in Guantanamo, black sites, Abu Ghraib, I mean, that torture is informed by Islamophobia. The specific tactics that were used and continue to be used, right, in various facilities in the war on terror is shaped by Islamophobia. It's shaped by what would sort of offend Muslims, right? Or what could sort of offend their religiosity and the way that they practice their religion. So it's been very surprising and extremely frustrating, honestly, to see how long these conversations have continued without that analysis. And I'm honestly just not sure why, because when you think about other forms of oppression that other marginalized groups are, subjected to, usually you have to acknowledge, right, the system of oppression that is shaping the way that the violence from the state is targeting them.
Right, right. Wow. Well, okay. I would love for you to talk more about the kind of like, I mean, we'll get into the content of the book, but even like the structure, because you organize the book in three parts, and I'll offer a sketch to you that I hope does justice. But I think the first part is really, it's like interrogating the ideology of Islamophobia and the war on terror and the question of how terrorism is defined and not defined and all of that, right? The second part is getting into the different kinds of violence that characterize or constitute the war on terror. And then the third part is about, I think, really appreciating and reckoning with the impacts of these kind of violence on Muslim people. So yeah, I wonder if you could talk about what led you to structure the book that way.
So, when you're writing a book, there are a lot of decisions you have to make about what's included, what's not included, how you're going to make the crucial points you want to make, how it's structured. And as someone who has been really interested in sort of different dimensions of the war on terror and the way that Islamophobia is rooted in the war on terror, to me, one of the most important things was not just to talk about law and policy, which is often the case, and that's not to minimize any of the work, but to me, one of the really important ways that these destructive Islamophobic policies have been developed and have been allowed to perpetuate and continue is through narrative. And to me, really taking a close look and examination at all the ways the US government has devised narratives to not only gain public support for problematic policies, but to also specifically and intentionally dehumanize Muslims as a justification for why they need to be targeted and as an excuse to justify state violence. And so to me, you can't really understand policy without understanding narrative, insofar as you want to get to how you can dismantle the war on terror, right? Because you can't just dismantle the policies without understanding the construction of narratives. Right. What are the ways that Muslims have been constructed specifically, right, as irredeemable, inherently violent, angry, etc.? How does that enter into the policy calculus? Then what does it do when you have policies targeting Muslims? How does that then shape the subsequent narrative? And basically, you're talking about two things that are existing to reinforce each other. So again, the formulation of the reason I wrote about specifically the first two parts, narrative and policy, was to really establish this deep connection in terms of how they rely on each other and reinforce one another. The last section, as you mentioned, is about not just Muslim experiences. I interviewed 11 Muslim Americans and sought out their experiences of the war on terror and their attitudes towards US government and other issues, complicated issues, but also to look at, a rarely recognized impact of the war on terror and existing in basically a state of oppression for the last 20 years in the context of the war on terror. Obviously, Muslim oppression has been in the United States since enslavement of Black Muslims. But one particular thing that we Muslim communities have often sort of talked about is the role of internalized Islamophobia, internalized oppression in the perpetuation of problematic policies that are targeting Muslims. So in essence, there are prominent leaders, there are prominent Muslim organizations that unfortunately have adopted the narratives of the state and have internalized them. And subsequently, they become participants in the state apparatus that then targets Muslims. And I think this is really important, as part of sort of my conceptualization and analysis, because it's often the case, right, that groups working on the same issue might generally have this perception that we're all working towards the same goal. But that's false, at least insofar as the Muslim community is concerned, right? And the war on terror has kind of served to sort of delineate and define sort of these two separate goals. And of course, there are more goals, but the goal of assimilation and acceptance by US society and the government, what does it mean to be a good citizen? And the other goal, which is to disrupt and dismantle the oppression of Muslims and other marginalized groups. So I think combining all of these things and really understanding sort of this more holistic picture of the war on terror and how deeply rooted Islamophobia is, how measurable it is that there are in fact ways you can concretely understand its impact. And then the ways in which Muslims themselves, again, have been impacted, targeted, but also how they've responded to the oppression that has been a part of the war on terror.
Wow. Okay. Well, yeah, I'm looking forward to let's drill down and explore some of those things. And I would love actually to start with where you started, which is the dehumanization of Muslims. And, I think that it will be, it'll be straightforward to folks, tuning in. Like, I don't think it'll be a surprise, that when you think about the war on terror, what it has involved around the world and what is involved in this country, like just the level of incredible violence, it requires some dehumanization, right? I think that is, it's straightforward. One of the things that really, additionally, that was really, that was very provocative for me to read when I was reading your book is that dehumanization, that project of dehumanizing Muslims, it is sort of, the way you lay it out, it is inevitably coupled with the humanization of Americans, or it's like, in order to dehumanize them, there has to be a humanizing of us. And there is this us them kind of binary dichotomy. So, you talk a bunch about the question of like Muslim rage, held up as this sort of essential attribute of Muslim individuals, of Muslim communities, of Muslim countries, but that coupled with the idea that, these people are kind of essentially fanatically enraged, there has to be this idea that, like, on the other hand, the forces carrying out this violence, American forces are not, there's no rage there. That's guided by like rational, calm, thought processes that are and values of justice, right? So I wonder if we could talk more about that, like about this kind of us and them thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I did focus specifically on dehumanization throughout the many narratives that have been deployed by the US government, whether we're talking about Bush, Obama, Trump, to really explain how it was so easy to perpetuate this war on terror. And, from the beginning, although Bush talked about, basically that there's some sort of difference, right? There's a distinction between those radical Muslims and, the Muslims in your neighborhoods, communities, et cetera. You're operating in a context in which Muslims have been essentially conflated into one homogenous group that have summarily been deemed as terrorists. And when you're developing a set of policies that then goes and targets Muslims in general, then that distinction that, Bush attempted to make obviously is just a way of hiding and minimizing, right, the ways again that Muslims are being targeted. And, part of this is, I talk a lot about social constructions, right? So what are some of the social constructions of Muslims that serve this project of dehumanization, right? And there are a lot of them, right? We could talk for hours about that. But Muslims are inherently angry. It's inexplicable rage, right?
Right.
Muslims are irredeemable. Muslims are barbaric. They're uncivilized. So again, we can see this in many contexts, right? Iraq, Afghanistan, like we're bringing a civilizing mission, right? And the bottom line is, I think, most importantly, as I've just mentioned, like the irredeemability of Muslims. And I think that that's important, right? Because if Muslims are irredeemable, then nothing other than state violence can be an intervention to their irredeemability. And, one specific example that I didn't really talk about in the book, but from an op-ed that I wrote earlier this year about abolishing Guantanamo, is the ways in particular that prisoners at Guantanamo have been constructed in much of the same terms, right? But my observation in the op-ed was about how, Guantanamo and other sort of war on terror prisons have been largely excluded from conversations around US carcerality and the mass incarceration movement, in addition to abolition. And I mention this because to me, there's this deep-rooted narrative, right, that's permeating into other spaces. And so when you think about, talking about the abolition of other prisons, right, it's not always the case that other prisoners are constructed as redeemable, for sure.
Right.
But terrorists can't be redeemed. There's nothing redeemable about being a terrorist, right? Because that's an inherent characteristic. And when you construct people as having not just characteristics, but inherent characteristics, and there's nothing, again, that you can do about that, except, again, to wage violence.
Right.
And, in addition to the sort of overt ways that this dehumanization narrative has been perpetuated throughout the war on terror, there's also the ways that Muslim victimhood is denied, which I also talk about, right? And who is denied victimhood? Those who are not considered human, right? They can't be victims if they're not human. We saw this with Abu Ghraib, right? The ways that the prisoners were talked about in general, right? But also the ways in which their victimhood was never really acknowledged. The narrative squarely focused on how the abuses and torture that occurred at Abu Ghraib were not an indication of the values and principles of the American government.
Right.
And if that's the focus, not only do we know that the prisoners were dehumanized because of the torture tactics that they were using, but also if their humanity isn't even acknowledged when such an abuse is public and no longer it's not deniable, then that also solidifies the idea that Muslims are not human and we don't have to care, right? And in all of these cases, there's always this sort of underlying premise, again, right, that they're all terrorists.
Right.
So they're just collateral damage anyway.
Right.
So, there's just so many ways. And, when I talked about the section on Muslim rage, even the idea that, Muslims are can be complex and nuanced. I don't recall the exact title of the book that I, referenced. But just like the surprise, right, that Muslims are not sort of these one-dimensional characters, right?
Right.
And there's just so many facets of the ways that Muslims have been dehumanized. And I think, to me, what I really wanted to impart is that you can see sort of this trajectory, right? It continues in different ways, in different forms, right? Obviously, Trump explicitly and overtly dehumanize Muslims, right? But Obama exponentially increased the use of drone warfare, right?
Right.
and in doing so was also killing Muslims. And even when, for example, right, he released the sort of standard operating procedures or the guidance around his drone warfare, I mean, that was of no comfort whatsoever. And basically the premise was, don't try to kill people, try to like make sure they're not like 5 years old, right? And there's really just no accountability. And so let me just stop at that point really too, because if you treat people as humans, then conceivably you would try to redress the injustice and take accountability. Right. There are many marginalized groups, right, in the United States who aren't afforded that, and that's a function of dehumanization, right? You don't owe accountability to those you don't consider human.
Right. That's so, yeah, humanity, when one can lay claim to humanity, then one can lay claim to the rights that come with that, including, the right to redress harm, right?
Right.
You just put so much on the table. So let's, it's all so rich. So I want to go back to what you said about, drawing on, abolitionist analyses around what is at the heart of carceral thinking anyway, right? Like, and looking at Guantanamo Bay, yes, in its own right, but also as part of a carceral system. And I think that's so important because there are so, I mean, you really in your book, you lay out a kind of construction of this unreal infrastructure over these past 2 decades, right? The Department of Homeland Security didn't exist 20 years ago, right? Now it does, among the various programs, et cetera. But also there was a pretty strong foundation, right? That came before the war on terror. And when I think about like mass incarceration in particular, right? There were all, which is one technology deployed by the US state that in particular has targeted Black Americans, right? Black people in this country. It introduced or maybe reintroduced, for a new era, this idea of irredeemability, right? Like it's like what the whole, when we think about the kind of conversations in the 1990s, kind of the height of mass incarceration and the notion of supermax prisons for super predators, it was all about what are we going to do with the worst of the worst? Mm-hmm. And Guantanamo Bay and the Black sites were discussed in precisely those terms. There are some people who are so bad that, I mean, there was under Obama, when there was one iteration of a conversation around closing Guantanamo, one of the plans that the Obama administration proposed was, well, what if we transfer the people detained at Guantanamo Bay to prisons in, on the mainland in the US, which is like, does not get at why are they detained to begin with, right? Okay, we'll put a pin in that. But and what was the response of Congress? It was like, no, we can't have these people on our shores, right? Like these people who weren't even charged with crimes, right? But we have a place for them because they're the worst of the worst. There's something exceptional, right? So that framework already existed thanks to mass incarceration and in particular kind of anti-Black politics. And then enter a particular form of irredeemability. And when you were talking about dehumanization and a sort of timeless quality that's attributed to Muslims, I just think about all that's been said about Afghanistan this year. Those people are in the 12th century. They're kind of this kind of frozen in time, essential, cartoon character. And when you say, well, the only remedy then is violence, what is really striking, again, just thinking about this year and the conversations around the withdrawal from Afghanistan, is that even violence wasn't enough. I mean, that's essentially what Biden said was, we spent 20 years of war in this place and they still are like this, there's nothing we can do. We're done. You know,
Right.
and it is precisely the irredeemability that you're talking about. Even an American occupation couldn't redeem these people.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And, with Afghanistan in particular, right? The idea of going to Afghanistan was the capture of Osama bin Laden, right? And that happened in 2011. And yet the US remained in Afghanistan, right? 10 years later. At the
Yeah,
same time, Biden said, we're not here to do nation building. And so the question is, so what were you there for the last 10 years,
right.
right? And again, it is that like sort of, dehumanizing, but also very patronizing narrative.
Mhm.
And that serves, again, to absolve the United States of the crimes and the violence it has inflicted on the Afghan people. And
Right.
I think your point about irredeemability is really important, because I was, in that op-ed focusing specifically on Guantanamo. And, I think one of the things that comes to my mind is maybe, my understanding of sort of the abolition framework is this idea that, if we address people's needs, right, and trying to create
Mhm.
this better society, right, we won't have such a large amount of crime, right, or the way crime is constructed, right.
Mhm.
Um, and so my sort of general perception of what abolition, the approach, and this is very basic, right, takes to understanding and sort of like intervening in this conception of criminality
Mhm.
would not apply to, right, Guantanamo Bay prisoners. And it's not to say that abolitionists don't apply it to that, but it is to say that terrorism has been constructed as such a uniquely different crime, right?
Yes.
Again, that cannot be compared with and is inherently more violent, right, than
Right.
other forms of crime.
Right.
But there's no way that we can sort of include the discussion of Guantanamo prisoners into the conception of abolition. And again, that's not to say that abolitionists do not do that, but
Mhm.
it is to say that it sort of complicates that a little bit more. And,
Mm.
another example that comes to mind is, there's various organizations, right, and groups that are organizing around this sort of hashtag of free them all.
Hmm.
And I remember having a conversation with one of the organizers, and I said, does this apply to Guantanamo? And she said, yeah, of course. And obviously that's the response I anticipated, right?
Mhm.
But then in terms of the narrative, right? When you're talking about the narratives that are lodged against the argument that we should free all the prisoners,
Mhm.
the counter arguments that organizers in these spaces would have to come to the table with for Guantanamo, right, would conceivably be different than that of other prisoners.
Hmm.
And again, it's because of the ways that the terrorism has been constructed, and terrorism again is an inherent quality. And even right when you look at
Right.
young Muslims, right, Muslims that have been murdered, children, right,
Right.
that's even dismissed because it's like, well, it's only a matter of time before they grow up to be a terrorist.
Right. Right.
So, I think that is a question like I'd love to talk with you more about is this transferability of irredeemability, but also just the ways it's manifested differently and based on different constructions of different types of crimes.
Right. Well, one way that you get at that in the book is when really interrogating the very slippery definitions that American officials offer, which are, and you have a whole thing about how there are these tautological, they're like, terrorism are acts done by terrorists. And it's like, well, what's a terrorist? Well, someone who commits terrorism. It's like, okay. um, you
We know
know,
it when we see it.
what's that? Yeah, we know it when we see it, right? And it's like, oh, okay, well, let's interrogate that, right? But one of the ways that you approach it is by exploring this this whole discourse of there is no moral equivalency between the violence of terrorism and then the violence of the US state. And so yes, occasionally the US will kill people, will kill civilians, you know we could say a lot about all of these categories, by the way, of who's considered a combatant, who's considered a civilian, what is the significance of that, et cetera, et cetera. So well, let's note that. But, you know, when it has come to light, when it breaks through, you know, that the US, that, you know, and you can name any of the many acts, bombing marketplaces, you know, weddings, hospitals, et cetera, neighborhoods, that might be unfortunate, but there's simply no comparison between what Americans do and what the American military does and what terrorists do. And I think that it gets at that, it gets at that special quality of the crime of terrorism that you're talking about, and the special characteristic of, you know, so-called terrorists, which, as we know, is deeply imbued, you know, racially. And the one thing I'll add about that is it's so it's reiterated so many times because there have been so many incidents of American violence, even that breakthrough. I mean, there's so many that there is no conversation about in this country, but even that breakthrough. And you know, there's one part in the book where you're talking about Abu Ghraib, for example, and how President George W. Bush said, you know, when talking about the acts of the guards who carried out this torture, so, well, that's not the America I know.
Right.
Right. You know, there's something about America that doesn't do this. And then there's something about terrorists that do this kind of thing. So it just, but it has to be constantly kind of reiterated. And it reminds me of that phrase that we're all familiar with whenever there's an incident of American violence, that this is not us. You know, when in fact, there's a lot of evidence that this comes from this place, right? Yeah.
Yeah, you know, some of the ways I started thinking about moral equivalence is, you know, through the narratives that the US government, you know, often deploys when it's talking about the actions and behaviors of the quote terrorists. And the way it's described as like brutal, and, you know, they're like killing massive amounts of Muslims and all this kind of stuff. And to me, if we were to replace, in most cases, the United States with whatever terrorist group has been designated in the statement, it would describe exactly the way that the United States has inflicted violence on the very same communities. And if the two things, the quote terrorists and the United States, if they're both behaving in the same way, and they basically become synonyms in a description of violence against Muslims, then to me, that sort of dissolves the argument that there can't be any moral equivalence. Furthermore, you know, statements from Bush, like in 2006, where he said, you know, basically, if there's any comparison between us and the terrorists, you know, like he's like, I simply can't, and they kill women and children. We know the United States has killed women and children. You know, that's not exactly where the United States has drawn the line at their violence, right? And with Osama bin Laden, right, you know, he is described as a mass murderer of Muslims, which of course is true. But in that particular case, the problem with that statement is that, you know, the United States is also a mass murderer of Muslims, and it's using that statement against Osama bin Laden to feign concern for Muslims, while at the same time victimizing Muslims in the exact same way. And so it's a very disturbing sort of tactic to minimize the violence of the United States. And I often think, of course, you have your own personal beliefs and ideologies and et cetera. But, you know, if you're someone and you're living in Afghanistan, Iraq, any number of the countries, Somalia, where the United States has bombed, has drone striked, et cetera, and you become a target of violence, how much will it matter to you, whether it's the United States or a terrorist group? Just in terms of the impacts, right? If your family is wiped off the face of the earth, how much will it matter to you? And of course, again, people have different positionalities and are operating with different contexts and beliefs about conflicts. But at the same time, if there's no difference in the scope or the brutality, then there's nothing that anyone can say about, oh, well, the United States came in, their violence was a little less bad,
Right.
right? It's the solution is even in Afghanistan, right? There was this dichotomy of like, do the Afghans want the United States or the Taliban? As if they have to be limited to those two options of violence. And as if we are the ones that get the right to impose this dichotomy onto them. So I think like when I wrote the op-ed earlier this year about, Ilhan Omar being accused of this moral equivalence, right? The
Right.
idea is, again, to disguise the fact that the violence of, in her statement, was the United States and Israel, right?
Mm-hmm.
Being somehow more moral, right, than
Mm-hmm.
that of Afghanistan and the Taliban. So it's a very, very, very disturbing tactic that's used.
Mm-hmm.
And, we know what the goal is, which is, again, to legitimize state violence, right? And to re-entrench the notion that the violence of terrorism, because of course we can't call the US's violence terrorism, the
Right.
violence of terrorism is uniquely and inherently more violent, more barbaric, more uncivilized.
Right. 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 We are primarily talking about the United States, but I'm glad that you put Israel on the table, and I'd be remiss in doing my job if I didn't note, as we're talking about terrorism and who defines that Israel just designated 6 human rights organizations as terrorist organizations, and that says a lot about who gets to decide what is terrorism and what is not, and how self-serving it is to get to have that the power to define. I wonder if we could switch gears a bit.
But can I just
Yes,
add
yeah, go for it.
something?
Yes, absolutely.
Now that you mentioned Israel, and
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
obviously, I don't talk a lot about Israel in the book at all, just because of limitations of time
A lot of other stuff to
competence.
talk about.
But I do think, when we talk about the cost of war, there's a cost of war project, and they look at, militarism and warfare abroad, not so much, well, or at all, like the domestic context. But to me, when we talk about the impacts of the war on terror, that's where countries like Israel come in, because the
Mm,
impact of the war on terror is not just about what the United States has done and the
mm,
violence and harm it has inflicted onto others, but the blueprint it created and legitimized for other equally violent countries to utilize, right?
right.
So this is a global apparatus, and we're not just talking about this, you're either with us or against us, sort of inclusion in the war on terror. I'm also, when we talk about the impacts of the war on terror, we also have to talk about countries like Israel that have taken this blueprint and ran with it. It's not to say that they didn't already have a violent infrastructure in place, but it is to say that the United States' war on terror and the blueprint and infrastructure that it created could easily be used and replicated in other contexts, and can capitalize on the same narratives of terrorism that the
Yes.
United States has utilized.
Yes. I mean, I'm so glad you said that, because you really see in the U.S.-Israel relationship the ways that they help each other in carrying out state violence. I mean, this point, and again, this is early in your book, we have American officials defining or not, terrorism, and we know it when we know terrorism when we see it.
Right.
And I think that a lot of Americans were able to say, "Oh, I know what terrorism looks like," because of Israel, was able to pointed to terrorism and terrorists for a long time. So that was part of the foundation, I think, in the American mind.
Right.
And then the U.S. declares a war on terror, and Israel immediately says, Yasser Arafat is our bin Laden. We also have, a bin Laden. And so, oh, thank you, U.S. You have done something that will be useful for our project as well.
Right. Right. And you see this in the Philippines, for example, right?
Mm.
As well, like in terms of countries that have basically taken the blueprint and started their own war on terror.
Yes.
Again, not just with the help of the United States, but with their own structures that were already in place.
Right. No, right on. Okay, so much more to say about that. I wonder if we could talk a bit about some of the stuff in the third part of your book, where you're really exploring what it has meant for the US state and its different component parts, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, et cetera, to integrate, you know, to work to integrate individuals and institutions in the Muslim community as part of this, and both integrate and brutalize, attack, and integrate to attack, try to enlist some allies in the Muslim community as part of attacking the broader community. And, just thinking about, yeah, it's been 20 years of this sort of chapter of that kind of violence. And I was really struck, last year there was this essay written by a journalist named Farnoosh Amiri, an Iranian American journalist, who grew up in California, who wrote about this harrowing experience, but one that I think will be familiar to many Muslims in this country. In 2005, as a 12-year-old, she woke up with armed officers, federal agents in tactical gear, telling her to get out of bed and join her family downstairs, where her father was detained with handcuffs. He was in his underwear in the living room, as these agents rifled through their things, went through photo albums, watched, home videos. They went through the whole house, searching for something. And then they left, and her father was not charged with any crimes. So the police didn't come back, but also her family never talked about it ever again. And we know that, in the days and weeks and years after the 9/11 attacks, Muslim households across this country got knocked at the door. And so, we could talk about that unreal level of violence of detentions, deportations, interrogations, surveillance, no-fly lists, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I wonder, one of the things that struck me was that this person, Farnoosh Amiri, did talk about it. She wrote this essay that was published on NPR, National Public Radio's website. She broke this silence, not only, she describes talking to her father about it and talking to her family about it, but she wrote about it. And I wonder where you think things are at. Do you think that there is some level of reckoning in the Muslim community in this country, and some level of sort of shaking off of these years of repression?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And, when I think about, the early years of the war on terror, it seemed like for many Muslims, right, they were sort of getting acclimated to the violence. And a lot of that acclimation led to fear, right? There was nothing you could look towards that signaled that, the war on terror was not going to target Muslims or was not going to be brutal. And also the fact that, essentially Bush said in his speech on September 20th, 2001, that this is going to be sort of a long war and you shouldn't expect an end, right? So
right.
There was, this, I think, just a lot of fear. And seeing what happened to other Muslims in the community, for example, if we just look at the domestic context, the numerous federal terrorism prosecutions, like the Holy Land Five, that really, really cemented the consequences that Muslims were going to pay as a result of, the suspicion, the warrantless surveillance. And, I think that, I look back and sometimes I think, like, I was younger. I was 18 when the 9/11 attacks happened. And so, I don't necessarily want to come at this in a place of judgment, but I think about, like, what could have been done differently. And I totally understand, obviously, that the Muslim community was in a state of fear. I think that there was, different degrees of fear based on, your expectations of what the United States is and was, so I've talked to many Black Muslims, and, they've
Right.
expressed obviously that, this was not a shock, right? That
Mhm.
that Muslims would be targeted in this way because of what happened. And so I think, the fear was warranted. And I think also Bush frequently gave mixed messages. I mean, for those who would believe him, right, about, we're not targeting the average Muslim or the Muslim in your community, right, or your neighborhood. We're just
Right.
targeting the radical Muslims.
Right.
So in some ways, signaling that you would be safe, right? The average Muslim is safe, which was
Mhm.
not true, right?
Mhm.
Um, because we know how the war on terror unfolded. Now, there is a section of my book where I talk about the different rhetorical tactics that were used by Bush and Obama. And, one of the sources I rely on, and I can pull it up later, is this book that sort of measures, for example, the number of times terrorism it was used in speeches by Bush, Obama, and then Trump.
Mhm.
And, the reason it's important is because what the author talks about is that Bush did most of the policy selling. And so Obama didn't have
Mhm.
to do as much.
Mhm.
And it's because of that, right, that Obama seemed to be sort of more benign.
Mhm.
He started his tenure as president, right, giving that speech in Cairo about sort of
Right.
reconciling with the quote Muslim world.
Right.
And so I think that that put some Muslims at least at a little bit of ease, even though in the backdrop, right, he was perpetuating egregious violence and surpassed in many ways that of Bush. I think Trump was sort of a catalyzing moment for
Mm.
Muslims because it was so overt
Mhm.
and explicit. And so I think that was, again, the Muslim community is so diverse and has had very different experiences in the United States.
Mhm.
But for some, at least, that sort of, the way that the Trump administration operated and the rhetoric they used that was deeply Islamophobic, I think politicized Muslims in a different way.
Mm.
And I think
Mm.
gave some at least, this sort of impetus to resist.
Yeah.
I think there was a lot more, maybe people speaking out against the abuses and violence of the war on terror. Now, the problem, unfortunately, with that is that, some Muslims' understanding of the violence of the war on terror then became sort of limited to the Trump administration.
Mm. Mhm.
Even though we know, right, the Trump administration could not have inflicted the level of violence that it did had it not
Right.
been for his predecessors.
Right.
And so, along the way, right, Muslims have had to make choices, right, about their safety and security, about whether they're going to assimilate in the ways that, assimilation is constructed. And, there's very different responses to that. And, I think as someone, for example, who's advocated against the use of Guantanamo Bay prison and torture, I've been one of the few Muslims involved at all since,
Mm.
2007. So I think there is a lot more sort of more of a desire, I think. And I think with younger Muslims, especially, like not wanting to, accept the status quo.
Mhm.
I think there is a lot more um, resistance towards the state. And I would say the resistance is informed by a very deep understanding of the violence of this country, not just in the context of the war on terror,
Right.
but far before that, right? Basically, the inception of this country.
Right.
I think that that's very, very promising. And then I will say, like, as I talked about in the book, in terms of internalized Islamophobia, right? Or if you think about generally speaking, or through a broader lens, internalized oppression,
Mhm.
right? The oppression that many marginalized communities unfortunately internalize, right? I think that's becoming an issue that more Muslims are willing to directly confront.
Mm.
And in the book, I look very carefully at internalized Islamophobia and give specific examples because to me, we're sort of at this place where we keep talking about it and circling around it.
Mm.
But now we have to directly confront it. Because to me, at this point, there are many Muslims who are specifically engaged in perpetuating the violence of the state.
Mm.
whether they're doing that specifically to harm Muslims, whether they're doing that because they think that they've gained the proverbial seat at the table and can make a difference, or whether they honestly believe what the narrative has told us for so many years about who Muslims are. The fact is that Muslims themselves, right, and this is not unique to Muslims, have become active participants again in the violence of the state. And to me, that has to absolutely be dismantled and disrupted. And if it's not, at the least, right, for those of us who are working towards a specific vision of justice and liberation, we can no longer include these Muslims in our conception of what that means, because that is simply not the path that many Muslims are taking us down. And again, I say this, with the recognition that Muslims are a very homogenous entity, right? But when you think about the basic ways in which a community would want to live it with equality, justice, inclusion, and how much do you have to compromise, or the sort of this, the choice that's been imposed on us in terms of how much do you want to compromise to be able to live like this?
Right.
And my answer is, I'm not going to compromise. I don't want to compromise. So, I think there's a lot to say about internalized oppression and internalized Islamophobia that I think is crucial to the discussion again of why Islamophobia continues to be perpetuated in the war on terror.
Wow. I mean, there's something so important about what you're saying, and so heavy. I mean, the person, Parnush Amiri, who I mentioned, in this essay that she writes for NPR, she actually talks about how, though her family didn't talk about this incident, it sort of silently became the occasion for her to sometimes unconsciously, sometimes consciously try to become more American. It is what you're talking about.
And also just like, who do we advocate for, right? And so, I've known I know many families who have loved ones in prison because of terrorism-related charges. And it, of course, has not always been the case that Muslim communities have rallied to support these individuals, families, and communities. And obviously there is, again, this element of fear. But it does make me think, to your question, what would have been different, right?
Right.
If we actively resisted, for example, in the Holy Land 5 case.
Right.
Would the founders of the Holy Land 5 still be in prison now?
Right.
Maybe not. But just thinking about, the ways we've internalized the constructions of Muslims ourselves to determine who we're going to advocate for. Again, obviously somewhat driven by fear,
right,
but also based on, how much are we going to align with the vision of the state, who gets to determine who these people are and who we know they're not.
Right. Yeah. And I know we're coming up at the hour, but I feel compelled as somebody who's not a Muslim, but who, works to build solidarity, like what could things have looked like if we had done a better job of that, and you mentioned the Trump era and how really one of the opening parts of it was actually the airport protests. There's so much to say about, but they were this mobilization across the country of many people, and many people who are not Muslim standing in solidarity with folks. And which was incredibly moving and powerful, and forced them to, they couldn't do the Muslim ban, then they had to rewrite it, and it stopped them, albeit briefly. And I just wonder, how could the past 2 decades have been different had we been able to mobilize that level of solidarity earlier?
Absolutely. And to your point, I mean, I think to the point about narrative, that's the protests at the airport and the Muslim ban in general, to me, demonstrates the importance of narrative, right? Because people believed that this Muslim ban was a unique policy targeting Muslims, right?
Sure.
That this was a Trump era thing. And because of that, and not exclusive to that, but there was a lot more mobilization and support and resistance against it. So again, I mean, to impart the idea that narrative is important, is crucial to understanding, not just how we resist Islamophobia, how we stand in solidarity with Muslims, but also how the state continues to legitimize its violence through narrative.
Right. Well, that's amazing. I wonder if it's okay if we can leave it there, since we're at the hour. But thank you so much. I mean, as you can tell, if you've been listening, there's so much in this book to explore. So this, as brilliant as this conversation has been, we've, I think, just scratched the surface. So go ahead and get the book. The link is in the chat. And thank you all for attending. I want to thank my coworker Netfa for making the show run smoothly, technologically, and for promoting the event. Shout out to my coworker Sarah also for helping to promote the event. And of course, gratitude to you, Maha, for all of your work and for this conversation today.
Thank you so much, Khury. It was really a pleasure, and I'm excited to follow up on this conversation. And thank you so much, Netfa, for your help with this event, and to Sarah as well.